7 decades since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, around 80 new fragments of the ancient texts have been revealed to the public.
For nearly 2,000 years, scrolls hidden near the Dead Sea were believed to protect sacred truth. Burned, crushed, and buried during moments of terror, they were thought unreadable forever. Then AI decoded them without touching a single fragment.
Using artificial intelligence, Italian scientists are piecing together the text that was lost, and what they reveal through this advanced infrared imaging are previously unknown details.
What it revealed was not comforting, holy, or reassuring. It suggests that the Bible we know is not an unchanged truth, but the final survivor of something far messier. Where these scrolls were never meant to be found. The Judean desert is often described as a place of faith and solitude, but history shows something far more brutal. This was not a holy destination, but a last refuge. The people found there did not travel into this desert to seek wisdom or peace. They fled into it because there was nowhere else left to go. Cities had fallen, food supplies were gone, and Roman soldiers were closing in. Capture meant torture, slavery, or public execution.
Spanning the east of Jerusalem towards the Dead Sea, this arid region has been a silent witness to millennia of history. It's where prophets walked, kings dreamed, and civilizations rose and fell.
Anyone who entered the desert caves understood the risk clearly. Survival was uncertain, and escape was unlikely. The desert did not protect people, but simply delayed what was coming. In 2021, archaeologists returned to one of the most unforgiving sites in the region, a place known today as the Cave of Horror. The name is not symbolic, as it is very literal. Decades earlier, explorers found the remains of more than 40 Jewish refugees inside. Men, women, and children who had fled during the Bar Kokhba revolt nearly 2,000 years ago. These were not warriors or priests, but families running from Roman forces that were methodically crushing resistance across Judea. When the Romans advanced, these people climbed into the cliffs, believing the cave might keep them hidden. It did not. The cave's position explains why no one escaped. It sits high along a sheer rock face overlooking a deep ravine. Even today, reaching it requires ropes, harnesses, and experienced climbers. There are no paths, no gradual slopes, and no easy exits. Once inside, movement is limited and visibility is poor. Archaeologists believe that when Roman patrols surrounded the area, those hiding inside were trapped completely. Some likely died from starvation, while others may have taken their own lives rather than be captured. The cave did not become a tomb by accident. Geography sealed it shut. Among the human remains, researchers found something else. There were tiny fragments of ancient scrolls scattered in the dust. These were not intact manuscripts stored in containers. They were broken pieces, some no larger than a fingernail, mixed directly with soil and bones. They had not been placed carefully or hidden with intention. They were dropped, lost, or abandoned during moments of panic.
Now, this is quite a discovery. Fragments of a biblical scroll, along with other relics, have been found in desert caves in Israel.
Whoever carried them likely believed the texts were important. But survival mattered more. Scrolls were left behind alongside people who never made it out alive. At the same time, attention returned to another site near the Dead Sea, Ein Gedi. Once a thriving oasis town, Ein Gedi was destroyed suddenly in the 6th century. Archaeological evidence shows signs of fire and rapid collapse, causing homes to be abandoned and daily objects were left in place. Whatever happened there did not allow time for recovery or rebuilding.
Have few secrets of Ein Gedi that have to be revealed, such as where was the village in this period.
The settlement vanished, frozen in the moment of destruction. Inside Ein Gedi's synagogue, archaeologists had discovered something strange decades earlier. In the Holy Ark, where sacred scrolls were normally kept, they found several blackened, hardened lumps. Taken together, these discoveries reveal a shared reality. These scrolls were not hidden for future discovery. They were not sealed away for protection or preservation. They were caught in moments of fear, violence, and collapse. They survived only because everything around them failed. And because of that destruction, human hands were never supposed to read them. Scrolls no one was ever meant to open. For decades, the Ein Gedi scroll sat in storage, untouched and almost forgotten. It did not look like a manuscript or even parchment. It looked like a lump of charcoal pulled from a fire. The surface was cracked, blackened, and brittle. Any attempt to handle it caused pieces to flake off instantly. Early experiments proved the risk clearly. If someone tried to unroll it, even slightly, it would disintegrate into dust. There would be no second attempt. Once destroyed, whatever it contained would be gone forever. So the scroll was sealed away, labeled unreadable, and placed into controlled storage, where it remained for more than 40 years. The situation was even worse with the scrolls from the Cave of Horror. There was no single scroll to examine, only fragments scattered across the cave floor. Some pieces were smaller than postage stamps. Others were warped or cracked, their surfaces distorted by time, heat, and pressure. No two fragments fit together cleanly. There were no edges to guide reconstruction, no margins to identify columns, and no clear direction of text. To the human eye, they looked like random scraps of ancient material, disconnected and meaningless. Traditional archaeology had reached a complete dead end. Physical restoration methods failed and chemical softening risked total collapse. Mechanical flattening destroyed the ink. Even advanced conservation techniques could not stabilize the material long enough to study it. Scholars were forced to admit a hard truth. These texts could not be opened. They could not be read, and any attempt to force the issue would erase them permanently. Over time, acceptance replaced curiosity. The scrolls became examples used in lectures and textbooks to illustrate archaeology's limits. They were proof that history does not always leave recoverable records. Some knowledge, no matter how important it once was, is simply lost. Researchers stopped asking what the scrolls said. The more pressing question became whether continuing to try was irresponsible. Was it better to preserve the fragments as objects or destroy them in the hope of learning something that might not even be there?
My favorite of these is Southwestern Baptist Seminary purchased some Dead Sea Scroll fragments.
That question lingered for years without an answer as funding dried up and interest faded. The scrolls remained locked away, preserved not because they could be studied, but because no one dared to risk their destruction. In effect, the scrolls became untouchable, not sacred, but fragile to the point of paralysis. Then, a shift occurred. It did not come from archaeologists trying harder or conservators developing better tools. It came from a change in perspective. Researchers began to ask a different question. What if the scrolls were never physically opened at all? What if they were not treated as fragile objects, but as sources of hidden information that could be accessed without contact? Instead of unrolling parchment, scientists began working with scans, measurements, and internal structures. The scrolls were no longer handled as ancient artifacts. They were treated as data that was complex and damaged, but potentially readable if examined in the right way. This shift removed the final barrier, and once that decision was made, the centuries-old silence surrounding the scrolls was about to end. That single decision triggered a breakthrough no one was prepared for. How AI read scrolls without touching them. The breakthrough began with a decision that felt almost reckless. Instead of trying to preserve the scrolls as physical objects, scientists chose to ignore the outer damage entirely and look inside them. The Ein Gedi scroll was placed into a micro-CT scanner, the same type of machine used to examine internal structures in medicine and materials science. Thousands of X-ray images were taken from every possible angle. These slices were then stacked together, creating a detailed three-dimensional digital model of the scroll's interior. For the first time, researchers could see inside a scroll that had been sealed by fire for nearly 1,500 years. What the scanner revealed was not text in any normal sense. It showed layers of tightly wrapped carbonized parchment compressed into irregular shapes. To a human observer, it looked like visual noise. But within that noise were measurable differences. The ancient ink used by the scribes contained trace amounts of metal, likely iron or lead. Even after being burned, those metallic particles were still slightly denser than the surrounding parchment. The scanner detected those differences at a microscopic level. To the naked eye, everything looked black and ruined. To the computer, ink and parchment were no longer the same. This is where AI entered the process. The raw scan data was fed into algorithms designed to identify patterns in distorted surfaces. The AI separated ink from parchment based purely on density values, not appearance. It then mapped the curved, folded layers of the scroll and calculated how those surfaces would look if they were laid flat. This process, known as virtual unwrapping, did something no human hand ever could. It unfolded the scroll mathematically without applying pressure, heat, or force of any kind. Layer by layer, the AI converted the three-dimensional data into two-dimensional images. Lines began to form, then shapes, then letters. For the first time since the synagogue at Ein Gedi burned, actual words emerged from the scroll, not guessed words or reconstructed phrases. Actual characters written by a human hand nearly 2 millennia earlier. A text that had been considered permanently lost was now readable, without the scroll ever being physically opened. At the same time, a separate AI system was working on the fragments from the Cave of Horror. These pieces were too small and too scattered for traditional reconstruction. But machine learning models were trained to recognize handwriting patterns.
The word here, ashuv, is clear, and it's supposed to be followed by another word, va'avo.
The AI analyzed the thickness of strokes, the angle of letters, spacing between characters, and even slight variations in how certain shapes were formed. Each fragment became part of a massive comparison system. Fragments that appeared unrelated to human eyes were suddenly linked by the AI. Pieces found meters apart were identified as coming from the same hand. Texts broken by fire, pressure, and time were digitally reassembled with a level of accuracy no scholar could achieve alone. Entire passages were reconstructed without a single fragment being physically moved. For the first time, texts hidden by fear, fire, and collapse were speaking again. Not through careful restoration, but through computation. What had survived destruction was no longer the parchment. It was the data embedded within it. But as the AI continued its analysis, something unexpected appeared in the results. The system was not just identifying letters and matching fragments. It was detecting irregularities in the writing itself. Patterns that suggested stress, instability, and inconsistency in the act of writing. This was not something the researchers had instructed it to look for. The AI was not only reading the text, but also reading the people who wrote it. The fear embedded in the writing. Once the text became readable, researchers expected the analysis to slow down. The goal had been to recover words, not to study how those words were written. But the AI systems did not stop once letters were identified. They continued measuring everything about the writing itself. Ink pressure, stroke length, spacing between characters, and the rhythm of how each line was formed were all logged and compared. These were not artistic choices. They were physical records of how a human body moved while writing. One fragment, identified as part of the Book of Nahum, drew immediate attention. The letters were legible, but they were unstable. The AI detected tiny deviations in stroke direction that repeated across the fragment. These were not random errors. They formed a consistent pattern of micro-tremors, embedded directly into the ink at the moment it touched the parchment. The variations were so small that no human eye could reliably notice them, but the system flagged them instantly. Researchers checked for every possible alternative explanation. They tested whether heat damage could cause similar distortions. It could not. They tested whether pressure from collapsing parchment layers could shift the ink after writing. It did not match. They tested for scanner noise, software artifacts, and image reconstruction errors. All were ruled out. The tremors were not caused by time, fire, or technology. They were part of the original act of writing. The only remaining explanations were biological and psychological. The scribe's hand was not steady. This could have been caused by age or illness, but the writing did not show the gradual decline associated with long-term physical weakness. Instead, the instability appeared uneven, spiking in certain sections and stabilizing briefly in others. That pattern pointed to acute situational stress. Context mattered. The Book of Nahum is a violent prophetic text focused on destruction, vengeance, and collapse. This fragment was being copied during a period when Roman forces were actively hunting Jewish rebels and refugees. People hiding in caves knew that discovery meant torture or execution. The writing suggests the scribe was not working at a desk in good light with time to rest. The AI models showed irregular pauses, inconsistent line spacing, and abrupt changes in pressure, as if the writer repeatedly stopped, listened, and continued. This meant something unsettling. These texts were not preserved calmly for future generations. They were being copied under threat, possibly underground, possibly injured, possibly while listening for footsteps above. The idea of sacred scripture being produced in controlled religious centers no longer held. The AI evidence pointed to copying done during flight, hiding, and siege. Even more disturbing was what the AI revealed next. As it compared fragments across different caves and time periods, it began identifying patterns of selection. Certain passages appeared repeatedly, copied with care even under extreme stress. Other passages were absent. Entire sections expected by modern readers were missing. Not damaged or incomplete, but simply not there. This absence was not random. The AI showed that scribes were making choices. In moments of fear and collapse, they were prioritizing which texts survived. Some material was copied again and again. Other material was ignored entirely. The system flagged consistent omissions across multiple fragments, suggesting deliberate exclusion rather than accidental loss. That meant the people preserving these texts were not just recording tradition. They were curating under pressure and threat with limited time and materials. The version of scripture that survived was shaped by crisis decisions made by individuals who believed they might not live to see the next day. This forced scholars to confront a hard reality. If fear influenced what was written, then fear also influenced what was preserved. The surviving texts were not neutral transmissions, but survival choices. And the AI had not finished its comparison because when the system widened its scope, it became clear that what survived was only part of a much larger, broken whole. The first revelation: Scripture was once unstable. Once the AI expanded its analysis beyond individual fragments, a larger pattern began to emerge. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not part of a single library, doctrine, or belief system. They came from multiple communities scattered across Judea, each preserving texts according to its own priorities. The system compared handwriting, vocabulary, spelling habits, and formatting styles, and the conclusion was shockingly clear. There was no unified version of Scripture during this period. Instead, parallel traditions were competing at the same time. The AI confirmed that many scrolls were not copies of a shared original text. Linguistic models showed meaningful disagreements between versions of the same book. Certain phrases appeared in one copy but were missing in another. Some passages were longer, others shorter. Words were substituted in ways that changed emphasis and interpretation. These were not copying mistakes, as the patterns were deliberate. Scribes were rewriting material to reflect local beliefs, political pressures, and theological disagreements. Even more unsettling was what was not present. Entire biblical books expected by modern readers were missing. Esther did not appear at all, and Chronicles was absent. This was not the result of fire or decay, as AI showed no evidence that these books had ever existed in this collection. They were either not yet accepted as authoritative, or were intentionally excluded. This meant that what later became essential scripture was once optional or controversial. Other books existed in multiple competing forms. The AI identified parallel versions of the same text that directly contradicted each other in tone, instruction, and theology. In some cases, divine punishment was emphasized, while in others, mercy was foregrounded. Some versions supported centralized authority, while others undermined it. These differences aligned closely with known historical pressures, including Roman occupation, internal Jewish conflict, and debates over leadership and survival. The AI also flagged evidence of active editing. Passages were inserted, removed, or reshaped over time. These changes were not random, but intentional to reflect shifting needs. Texts were adjusted to reinforce group identity, justify resistance, or promote obedience, depending on the moment. Scripture was not treated as untouchable, but was a tool being shaped in real time by communities under threat. This finding directly challenged a core assumption held by many believers and historians alike. The idea of an unbroken, unchanged transmission from ancient times did not match the evidence. What the AI revealed instead was instability. The text was still forming and authority had not yet been decided. Competing versions existed openly, without one dominant standard. The Dead Sea Scrolls showed a period of textual chaos where belief had not yet hardened into doctrine. Meaning was negotiated, argued over, and revised because Scripture was not a fixed object passed down intact. Instead, it was a living body of material still being contested. The implication was impossible to ignore. The Bible as it exists today was not inevitable. It was not the only version in circulation, but one outcome among many possibilities. Other versions and interpretations existed and survived long enough to be written down. They simply did not win. And that raised a deeply uncomfortable question. If Scripture was once unstable, then something had to happen to make it stable. And that is when the AI identified the point where the alternatives stopped, and only one version remained. The second revelation, when one version erased all others. When the Ein Gedi scroll was finally decoded, researchers expected a familiar result. Based on everything the AI had already uncovered from the Dead Sea Scrolls, variation was assumed. Earlier texts disagreed with each other openly. Scripture had been fluid, edited, and contested. There was no reason to believe this scroll would be different. In fact, scholars expected it to confirm the same instability, another data point in a long history of disagreement. Instead, the AI produced a result that immediately unsettled everyone involved. The digitally unwrapped scroll contained passages from the Book of Leviticus, dated securely to the 3rd or 4th century AD. That date alone was surprising. Most scholars believed that a fully standardized Hebrew Bible did not exist yet. The assumption was that uniformity emerged much later, after centuries of copying and gradual consensus. But the AI's reconstruction showed something far more abrupt. The text did not merely resemble the modern Hebrew Bible. It did not approximate it or share broad similarities. Instead, it matched it exactly. Every word, every letter, every spacing choice aligned perfectly with the Masoretic text still used today. There were no variants, alternate spellings, or ideological shifts. The agreement was absolute. This created a serious problem. Just one chapter earlier, the AI had demonstrated that Scripture had once existed in multiple competing forms. Different communities edited texts freely, entire books were missing, and others existed in contradictory versions. Yet here was a scroll from centuries later that showed no trace of that chaos. The fluid tradition had disappeared completely. The implication was unavoidable. Somewhere between the period represented in the Judean desert caves and the creation of the Ein Gedi scroll, the textual landscape collapsed. The diversity did not slowly narrow over time. It did not evolve naturally, but ended. Even more disturbing was what the AI did not find. There were no surviving parallel versions from the same period, no competing Leviticus texts or alternate traditions running alongside the standardized one. The historical record showed no overlap. The moment this version appears, it stands alone. This is not how organic preservation usually works. In most traditions, older variants continue to circulate for generations, even after a dominant version emerges. Copies overlap and differences persist. Here, that did not happen. The AI's analysis showed a hard cutoff. Before this point, many versions existed. After it, only one remained. And there was no record explaining how this happened. No council transcript survives describing the decision, no documented debate records the rejection of alternatives, and no historical account explains why one version was chosen and others were abandoned. The transition left almost no trace, except for its result. What the AI exposed was not gradual standardization, but enforcement. There was a single moment where textual variation ceased to be tolerated. From that point forward, copying became rigid, and deviations were no longer allowed to survive. Scripture stopped evolving and started being controlled. That realization reframed everything that came before. The Bible did not simply endure unchanged through time. It passed through a narrowing point so severe that all alternatives disappeared. And that raised a final, deeply uncomfortable question. If one version survived because all others vanished, then who decided which version deserved to remain? And how are we even sure we are with the right version today? The truth about the unbroken chain. The AI evidence leaves no neutral interpretation. For centuries, scholars described Scripture as an unbroken chain that was carefully copied, faithfully preserved, and passed down without interruption. But the data does not support that story. What the AI revealed instead was a sharp break. Multiple versions of Scripture once existed openly, used by different communities at the same time. Then, suddenly, they did not. This was not gradual agreement, but selection. At some point in history, humans decided which version of Scripture would survive and which would disappear. That decision did not leave a paper trail. There is no surviving record of who authorized it, who enforced it, or what criteria were used. We do not know whether the choice was theological, political, practical, or driven by fear. What we do know is that the outcome was absolute. Entire books vanished without explanation, and these were not lost to fire or decay. The AI showed patterns of copying and preservation that make accidental loss unlikely. Texts that mattered were reproduced carefully. Texts that did not were allowed to disappear. That means removal was deliberate. At the same time, the version that survived was preserved with extreme precision. The Ein Gedi scroll proves that once this version was locked in, deviation was no longer tolerated. The result is deeply unsettling. The version of Scripture presented today as eternal and unchanged is not a starting point, but an end point. It is the product of a filtering process that erased alternatives so thoroughly that no comparison is possible. We cannot examine what was removed or measure how meanings differed. We cannot know which laws were softened, which commands were sharpened, or which ideas were excluded entirely. This creates a permanent blind spot. Believers are told they are following an ancient, unaltered truth, but the AI shows that truth passed through a narrowing gate controlled by human hands. Once through that gate, everything else was lost. There is no control sample, no parallel tradition, and no way to test what was left behind. That absence matters. If earlier versions disagreed, then interpretation mattered. If interpretation mattered, then authority mattered. And if authority mattered, then Scripture was shaped by power as much as belief. The surviving text may reflect survival strategy, political stability, or enforced unity as much as divine message. The most disturbing implication is not that Scripture is false. It is that certainty that is misplaced. What is treated as divine truth today may be the result of historical pressure, human decision-making, and elimination, not revelation alone. The AI did not invent this conclusion as it surfaced it from the data, and there is no way to undo it. AI did not disprove Scripture. It exposed something harder to accept, that belief may rest not on what was originally written, but on what history allowed to survive.